Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of I Like to Read with me, your host, Rachel Polanski. Today, I am very, very excited to be joined by Richard Chizmar. Richard Chizmar is an American writer. He is also the publisher and editor of Cemetery Dance magazine and the owner of Cemetery Dance Publications. Today, we are discussing his most recent book, Chasing the Boogeyman, which was published in August 2021. He also edits anthologies, produces films, writes screenplays, and teaches writing. So a Renaissance man, if you will. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm super excited. This has been, we've been in communication for a little bit behind the scenes tea, because I read your book. I think it was April of this year. And so I've been wanting to be with you since then, wanting to introduce you since then, but you're a busy guy. So we're glad to finally have you on the show. So my first question for you is, when did your love of horror emerge? And did that always coincide with a love of writing, or did the two kind of converge at a different point in your life?
You know what? They converged pretty quickly. Because I kind of, that initial kind of spark, I was really young. It was like, watching Wizard of Oz, and I'm like, oh my God, my favorite part is the haunted trees, flying monkeys.
Right.
Yeah, nightmares about those things every night. But I can't wait till it comes on again, because that was back before, you could like plop in a VCR in the machine. Right. And it was like event television when these things came on. But a really early age, I even remember watching like Chitty Chitty Bang Bang and the child snatcher with the net, terrifying, but it was my favorite part again. So then it was, like Abbott and Costello meets the Mummy and Frankenstein, and,
right.
and it just kind of built, and eventually like Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and eventually by the time I was in my early teens, I got turned on to Stephen King, and once that happened, within a year or two, it's kind of set in stone. But even when I was watching those, the things that scared me really early on, I reading like monster stories and trying to sell them to my friends, and
wow.
A lot of copy and that. So yeah, I was trying to be a writer from probably 7, 8, 9 years old.
Wow. And yeah, it's crazy how some of those old movies have these really dark, like, things, even though they're rated G, and it's kind of like, I don't know, what were they smoking, or what were they doing back then? For opium, poppy seeds, for at least the Wizard of Oz. So tell me more about your writing trajectory then. So you started writing these stories when you were 7 or 8. When did that transition to then, writing for magazines and publications, and then eventually full-scale novels and books?
You know what? Sometime in there, I was a weird kid, because I was always outside, but, I was definitely active, but I was also the kid who always had a book with him. Climb a tree and read a book for 2 hours. And, but at the same time, I was out playing ball with my friends, but once I got older, like into high school, I was more sports and girls. So the writing stuff kind of, I remember, I was a typical student. I hated having to write papers, anything that was with structure. And there were no like creative writing classes in my high school, but I had several teachers. I had an English teacher, Richard Gallagher, who really encouraged me. He could see that I enjoyed, when we had the freedom to kind of go out, color outside the lines. He could see that I really enjoyed that. And, he used to, I'm still in touch, and we still have lunch, and he's come to several of my book signings, but I always laugh because I can remember him saying, you know what, Rich, if you spent more than an hour on this paper, you would have got an A. And I was like, no, I'm good with it. But yeah, he was always very encouraging, and a couple others. So I knew, the love was still there. And it was actually Mr. Gallagher because I had him in 10th grade and 12th, my sophomore and my senior years. And as a sophomore, he brought in photocopies of a story called The Monkey by Stephen King.
Wow.
I didn't know it was pulled out of a girl. It was like a little chapbook, but he photocopied it and he passed it around class, and we read it out loud. And that was another big moment, because by the time I got in high school, my reading kind of taken a backseat too, because again, you're busy being social and growing up. But reading The Monkey in class kind of opened the door back open, opened it again for me. And yeah, so that interest was always there, but, then I went to college on a lacrosse scholarship. So the first half years, I was more, again, still, more worried about, goals and doing well. And then during my junior year, I got hurt. I played through a lot of injuries and I got hurt and I decided to be done because it was just too much. And that was when It came out by Stephen King. Okay. And I remember that the book kind of saved me because I was very lost. All of a sudden, my identity as this, college athlete was gone overnight. And I didn't know what was next for me. And I remember buying a copy of It and kind of parceling it out at the end because I didn't want it to end. And it took me a couple of weeks to read. And by the time I was finished, I was like, you know what? I remember what I'm supposed to do. And let's be it. I literally, like a week later, I started writing for the college paper where I was at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And then I decided to transfer to University of Maryland for journalism. And it was there during my final year that I started Cemetery Dance Magazine and was submitting stories all over. So yeah, it was probably my third year of college where it became serious for me. And I can always trace it back to when It was published.
I love that you have such a specific, tangible memory with that, and the way that it also has come full circle with, your love of the Universal monsters and the classics. And then now you're embracing the early 90s is when It came out, right? I think
it was 80s.
80s. I mean, I was born in 94, so I'm a little younger than you.
I want to say, let me say 83, 85. I want to say 86, 87.
Okay. So it was, because he's been writing forever. So yeah, I always forget how far back it goes.
Yeah. Yeah. I just remember a big tower of hardcover copies of It in the bookstore and me kind of stopping like, oh my, what's this? And yeah.
And that's also so, almost serendipitous how I think a lot of people, from what I've heard with college athletes, is if whether or not they make it through the 4 years or if they have an injury or whatnot, that it's really hard to sort of bounce back from that being your entire identity and that taking up your entire time. And the fact that you were just so able to pick up that love of writing again and now, successfully, however many years later, I just think that's a really cool intro story. And I had no idea about you. So I love how, writers and authors can all have their own origin and intro stories.
Yeah, it was, I always tell people, when if I'm mentioning that during a talk or something, I'm like, look, we all know we take poetic license with certain things and we exaggerate and makes things a little dramatic. And but no, this was, the step A through B through C through D, the progression was really clear. And it was a case of me just being lost. And I remember, I don't know when we published our anniversary edition of It. Well, I think it was the 25th anniversary. So sometime back in 2000 something. But I remember telling Stephen King's agent, Chuck Varell, who passed away recently, a really great guy. And I remember telling him that story. And I kind of stopped and I was like, I'm not trying to convince you to let us do the limit. I said, it just really did save me. And it kind of put me back on that path. And there are certain moments that I look back and I actually look back with a little terror because it was a library talk I did one night where through the Q&A section of the talk at the end, I talked about these things. I talked about the monkey in 10th grade. I talked about It when I was a junior in college and a couple other things that happened after that once I had started the business. And I remember I kind of caught my breath because I remember thinking, there were 4 or 5 critical moments in the life of Cemetery Dance and my life as a writer. And it just kind of scared me that, what if 2 or 3 of those things didn't happen? I might be doing something completely different right now, which is really scary for me because I don't know what it would be, but
you ended up where you were supposed to.
Yeah. And that's it. And I had these things, I had that teacher in 10th grade who reminded me with King's It. And then I had It, the book itself that did that. And then there are, certain things with Steve himself later, once we became friends, conversations and things that kind of kept me on the path at times when I was kind of deciding what I wanted to do next. So yeah, I've been very fortunate. And it's also a little, it's a little movie like. And when you look back, I had those moments. So I was definitely blessed for that.
Yeah, maybe one day they'll be making a biopic about your life. It sounds like it's pretty cinematic. So
closest we're going to get.
So, you talked a little bit about how we embellish even our own stories. And of course, that's where metafiction comes into context. And that's where your book lies. It's a very tricky genre to navigate. Was that always the original plan for your book, or did it sort of come about as you were writing?
No, I just, when I was it was not my original intention. I would never, I am very much a behind the scenes person. I don't go to many conferences or writing shows. That part of my bio that says I'm a writing instructor, that's because, I've been talking to different writing conferences decades ago. So I figured, tack that on there. But yeah, I don't get out much. So the idea of sitting down and making myself a character, the main character in a book is really far-fetched. But what happened is I was probably halfway or, 3/4 of the way through the introduction to the book. And I realized, that this is me. Okay. This is me, going to be me. I'm not going to be able to hide behind, a made up name this time. So I might as well just write it like it's me. I'm a big true crime fan. I said, so let's just, let's treat, my original phrasing was, let's Blair Witch this story and try to convince everyone that it really happened to me and just see what happens. So yeah, when I got to the end of the book, I thought, I have no idea what I have. If it's, I said, I thought this is the most fun I've ever had writing a book, which is weird because a lot of people die and it's pretty dark. Book about the loss of innocence of myself and my hometown. But it was such a joy. And it's because I got to revisit all these places and moments and people. And, my parents have been gone for years, but, for 6 months, or actually, I think it only took me 3 or 4 months because it was so much fun. Right. But for those months, they were back and I was living in a room and it was, so it was a lot of fun, but no, it was not intended that way. It was not. Everything with that book was a happy accident because I can say that because I remember when my agent read it, I said, look, it's just this old fashioned kind of campfire story. It's the same kind of stories I used to tell my friends when I was young to scare them. And I said, instead, it's kind of for grownups. I said, but it's for young people too. And I said, it has a lot of heart. And I said, I don't know, a whole lot of other serial killer books that have a lot of heart. And I said, so I don't know if that's a misstep or not. I said, but it was the only way I could write the book. So none of it was like outlined or plotted. I had a movie producer say it's like the Wonder Years meets Silence of the Lambs. And I love the Wonder Years series. But it wasn't intended, it's just the way it came out. So I really, again, very fortunate that my agent liked it, that a publisher liked it, and then that they were able to really promote it and, get it out there for people.
Yeah, I love Silence of the Lambs. Actually, I have a Death's Head moth necklace, and I also have one tattooed on me. I'm a very big fan over here. So that's why I really liked it, because it reminded me of those sort of like gritty 90s thrillers combined with true crime. Have you seen the West Memphis 3 documentary about it reminded me of that sort of like, again, like gritty indie Blair Witch vibe, but that's why it seems so much. It's crazy that you just found that accidentally. It seems like the sort of idea that would have been kind of cooking and planned in your brain. So was it originally going to just be a totally fictionalized character, like different than you?
And then I realized, like I said, as I was writing the introduction, I realized I was putting, usually a lot of especially in my short stories, there's a lot of me in a lot of the characters. I know some writers don't do that. I feel like I kind of hit my stride once I started doing that. I feel like my first 10 years of writing, I was writing about a lot of things I had no clue about, and it shows in the story. Not a lot of, there's not a lot of emotional weight to them. They're just, I'm really just strictly trying to entertain, kind of like a pre-identified audience. And once I kind of stepped away from that and just said, I'm going to write stories I want to write, that are important to me, and hopefully others will like them. That's when readers kind of started paying attention to me. So I always tell newer writers that I'm like, take that chance and trust yourself, trust your voice, that you have a story that people will want to hear or to read. And that was a big jump of faith with Boogeyman, because again, I was writing it was such a personal story, that I remember thinking, when I turned it in and it started getting buzz and I got paid a lot of money and blah, blah, blah. And I remember thinking, oh my God, it really is a small story. It's just about this kid from this small town, his experiences, his friends, his family. And I just remember thinking, who's going to care about that? And what was so cool about that is right away, within the first week of publication, I started getting emails, and I started, people were posting online. And what was great is it kind of reminded me, Rich, you're a big dummy, because guess what? This isn't just your story. This is a story that a lot of people can identify with. And that was the neat thing. I was hearing from people all over the country, and some not even from the US, but overseas. And they said, I forgot all about popping tar bubbles with my toes in the road. And I forgot all about throwing crab apples at cars. And I forgot all about this and that. And they're like, you wrote about my childhood. I don't know how you knew, but you wrote my childhood. And it was such a good feeling for me, because I remember, I feel like, a big lesson was learned. And that was, what, if you are writing honestly, and you're kind of giving up part of yourself in the process, and you're really trusting that some people will connect with it, it's bound to happen. And that was the biggest surprise for me with the book, is that just so many people responded to the coming of age part of it, and just said, you wrote, and even I had people write me and say, okay, I didn't have this childhood, but after reading your book, I wish I did. And my own kids, they're like, my God, you guys ran around the neighborhood like a bunch of, hoodlums. And I'm like, yeah, that's what it was like growing up in the 70s and 80s. You didn't have, nobody had computers and phones, so right. Everything was, or, these marathon Monopoly, games in the basement, and paneled basements and big tube TVs and all that. So yeah, it was a simpler time, and it was fun to write about.
Yeah, phones and technology. I mean, I kind of like grew up on the cusp when they were, just internet and computers were just becoming big. And it's kind of crazy to think, like, I can't imagine my life without them. But also I did have a slight period when I didn't live with, I was so young too. It's great. Kids these days, they're coming out with iPads in their hands. It's crazy.
Oh, well, like, my kids have been fortunate that they've had some of those experiences of running around with their friends at night and that kind of thing. But the idea that we were like, hey, we're going over so-and-so's house to spend the night, and then we were out roaming the streets all night, they couldn't even fathom that. Or, you just, you leave in the morning and you're like, I'm going to have lunch over the Kavanaugh, so you don't have to come home until dinner,
Right. It's much more of a novelty now. And if you don't know where your kid is for like over 3 hours, you're like, oh my God, let's go to the police. Like it's a totally different world out there.
So, yeah, it was interesting. But again, a lesson learned. A lot of the reviews keyed in on, kind of, it was really original because of this and that and this. And at each turn, I kind of had to admit, no, that was just an accident. I'm not that calculating, because, I got a lot of credit for being really clever with not only the kind of, the meta fiction part of it, but the true crime and the photographs and all those. And I'm like, the only thing I can take credit for being smart about, I think, are the photographs, because they were really important to me. Because when I read, I'm a huge true crime fan. And when I read true crime, the photographs are always central to the story for me. I find myself and I don't like how they're all in one or two sections of the book, because I constantly have to flip back and forth. And I'm never, very few, if you read true crime, very few are there's not a lot of what's the word I'm looking for,
literary classics.
Well, as far as the photographs, and a lot of them, most of them are pretty tasteful. You're not going to see these real bloody,
right.
Things like that. And that's not what would interest me. What always interests me is turning back and seeing the faces. Or they do show the crime scene, but it's just, it's a patch of grass.
It's like OJ's glove on the ground, and you're like, great.
but I'm captivated by those images. And so I knew right away when I decided I wanted to write this in a true crime format, I want the photos. And I'll do, we hired actors and we used friends and family. And I knew I wanted them at the end of each chapter, because I kind of wanted it to build, and I wanted it to be readily available as you were reading about it. So that's the only thing I kind of take credit for being smart. The rest just luck. Trust me.
Yeah, that's a really good point about the photographs. I pretty much read everything on my e-reader. So especially the photos are going to be in black and white, even if they were in color in the actual publication. And then it's also very inconvenient to flip back. In a way it's easier, but it's definitely, I appreciated that they were at the end of the chapter. I have to assume, since you're a true crime fan, that maybe I'm assuming a little too much, but the Golden State Killer and, the Night Stalker and the Visalia Ransacker, was that a big influence on this? I definitely feel like, were you writing this? Was he already caught at the time you wrote this, or was he still at large?
No, I don't know the timeline. When did the book come out?
Your book came out in let's see, when was he caught? Golden State Killer. I feel like it was before. It almost, the time also is like, what even is it? But were you familiar with Michelle McNamara's work and her intense? I'm assuming, yeah.
As soon as it came out.
He was caught in 2020. And so he was caught, like fall of 2020, I think, is when he was caught. So is that when you were writing this?
I'm trying to think. I sold it. So I'm trying to think when we sold it. I sold it that fall. So very
interesting coincidence.
Yeah. But actually at the end of the book, and the way this guy was caught, and I won't have any spoilers, but the way chasing the Boogeyman, it actually came from a real case. A very good friend of mine was the victim of a home invasion and a rape, and it's horrible situation. But the way that the bad guy, the way that the Boogeyman is caught at the end, in the afterword of chasing the Boogeyman, was with the sweat and the DNA, is exactly how this guy was caught 2 years after the crime was committed. As far as, he was sitting right there in the police station, and they swabbed and they matched that DNA and put him away for life. So, what I loved about the Michelle McNamara book is she really, again, I tend to connect with people who write honestly and kind of vulnerably. Mm-hmm. And that, with a capital, H, as far as the honesty is concerned, she just put herself all out in that book, and she kind of laid her life out there for you. And that was intriguing to me, that again, the whole thing of, of obsession, and our obsession, as far as a country and a population, as far as our obsession with evil, and in the sequel to Chasing the Boogeyman, which I just turned in, I guess, a month ago.
Ooh, very exciting. Yeah,
I'm really excited. That's kind of the overall theme is why does it exist so much? Not only in the crazy people, as respectfully as possible, but if you're writing a guy you've never met in prison who's killed dozens of people and proclaiming your love for him, I think it's probably safe to say you're a little off your rocker.
Yeah, for sure.
People, but the pretty normal people like me and lots of others who still have this, what's bordering on an obsession with darkness and people who do bad things. And that's what the book is about is, I touch on all that in the beginning of Chasing the Boogeyman. As the story unfolds, I'm the guy who found a photograph on the ground from one of the memorials and stuck it in his pocket and took it home. So yeah, it's there and it's kind of highlighted in the next book.
I love the layers too, because of course, when you're writing metafiction, you're writing a version of yourself, but then you're also writing, this fictionalized serious, like you're really you're touching on so many things that are real, but you're respecting it, because I also have this obsession with true crime too, and I found the more and more that I immerse myself in it, there's just so many ways to pay respect to victims and to incidents that happen, and there's so many ways not to, and to exploit it. And I think there's very tasteful ways, because we're all interested, not in the victims' lives, but also why these people did these things. And we are interested in who they were. And I think we can't deny that giving weight to that is slightly problematic. And I think it's a really philosophical, fascinating question. It's like, why are we so fascinated by this? Even if, if you've had something happen to you, if not, like, I don't know how I would react in one of those situations. And I think maybe it's, thinking about it allows you to be a little more prepared if it ever did happen. But I have to ask, of course, do you have like a quote unquote favorite, even though it's, objectifying it, and I'm just being the hypocrite who just talked about not to say it. But if you had to, certain true crime stories that have maybe, stuck with you or just fascinated you and almost, really played a part in how you framed this book.
Yeah, I mean, one of the, and again, I'm sure this is a very popular answer. It's not a very, again, I should try to think of something obscure, like, this happened in France at the turn of the, instead it's, when I read Anne Rule, I do tons of interviews and people, I say, what's the scariest book you've ever read? And I'm like, well, it sounds a lot, there's some others. But every once in a while when I'm actually thinking, instead of just answering, I always say, Anne Rule's The Stranger
Beside Me. Yeah.
Funny one. And I'm like, because when I read that book, and I've read it probably 3 or 4 times now, but when I read that book the first time, I knew plenty about serial killers. I'd read quite a bit. I'd seen all the movies, read a lot of fiction as well as the nonfiction. But that book just, not only because of her connection with him and really highlighting the fact that these are our neighbors, in some cases, friends. And I've always had that. I've always, again, I touched on that with chasing, even as a kid walking down the street, I was always well aware that, that house looks nice and cozy with its golden light kind of seeping outside and the darkness and all that. But we never know what goes on behind those closed doors. And I've always had that thought. I've always kind of known that, we all wear masks and behind some of them is really, really bad stuff. But reading that book really put that spotlight on that. And I just remember not being able to shake a lot of details that when she wrote about, him beating those women with pieces of, cordwood, firewood that he had picked up outside the sorority house down in Florida. Yeah. I mean, that detail stuck with me for so long. And other, moments, the girl he took from the lake, and just,
he integrated himself. He had a girlfriend, or they weren't officially married. Were they a fiance maybe? And he, helped raise her daughter. I mean, she had no idea. It's wild.
Yeah, I can't say that's my favorite, but that is the one that I'll always pick, because I think she did an amazing job. And he was just really the definition of a human monster.
Isn't it crazy too how there are these people out there in the world who are so good at navigating these monsters, because he was incredibly intelligent, and he knew that he could have taken so much of this information and details with him to the grave. And that's sort of the ultimate sin. When we catch the serial killer, great, but do we fully know how many women he attacked and murdered? I don't know, but thanks to Anne Rule, not only did she write an article, but she really, like, the way you're able to immerse yourself in that life and I haven't read the book in a long time, but I'm sure, she talks about the struggle, as I say with Michelle McNamara, the psychological toll that it takes on you, even if you're the strongest person. Like, it's got to be hard to navigate those, but without them, we wouldn't get the certain perspectives or those nuanced looks into evil and to maybe help understand. I mean, do you think it's the obsession with Ted Bundy specifically has almost like the star has burned too bright, and it's almost like overshadowed the actual implications of the fact that this was a really dangerous man and a serial killer, and now he's just sort of become like almost fetishized as this like serial killer symbol?
Well, yeah, I mean, he became an icon, and women flocked to the court cases, and
he's not even that cute, honestly. Like,
No, but you know what? Evidently, he and some of the others, they had this charisma to them that was
Right.
This almost magnetic, attraction thing going. And again, I really explored that with the Boogeyman sequel because, we turn these people, into icons, and we turn them into almost, there's websites devoted to them and message boards and the whole thing.
It's crazy.
And especially like with copycat killers, it's usually because of the media attention.
Right.
They want that attention and they want to be immortalized. And so, it's like this never ending kind of loop, and we're all part of it as far as, the fans and the writers and the movie makers and some of the people who, are in law enforcement who love the attention and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, no, I just, it's intriguing. And again, I'm kind of using these books to, in a way of kind of staring in the mirror myself. And I had a lot of people with Boogeyman, a ton of people, Rich, what was real, what wasn't.
Right.
We say, well, everything up to the point where the first murder occurs is real. All that childhood recollection really happened. Even the gross stuff. That is the way I saw my first brawl on a teenage girl was because she wrecked her bike and her shirt almost got ripped off her back. And yes, we were worried that she, may have had a concussion or even died. Once I saw the red bra, I'm 13.
That's all you're focused on. Yeah.
I'm like, that was a Wonder Years moment, from the television series. I'm just like, and so many people responded to it. They're like, oh my God, that felt like a movie. But yeah, I always told people up until the first murder. And then I'm like, and plenty of stuff after that, as far as the family dealings and my friends and Kara, my fiance at the time. And I'm like, but what I tried to do is I tried to be as honest as I could about how I would react to certain things. And that's where Carly, Albright kind of came in. She was almost like my conscience of the story. And people were so bummed that there is no because I'm like, yeah, there really is a Jimmy Cavanaugh, my buddy, who I went up to the microphone with, and there really is a Brian Anderson, and there really is this person. But Carly is the one that they all kind of fell in love with. And I'm like, I grew up with 3 older sisters, a lot of, strong female, role models in my life. And I said, she was kind of that sassy, smart, combination of all of them. And that's why she's the one kind of giving me shit, saying, you're rich. You want this guy to be, Hannibal Lecter because you love Silence of the Lambs because it came out that summer. But they're not usually like that. They're usually just, the weird guys who sat in the corner of the classroom, and not because they were shy, but because they were legit weird. And
they were thinking about stabbing everyone with a pencil, like that kind of person. Yeah.
And things like that. So, but yeah, I tried, even when it was unflattering, I tried to be as honest as I could to what my reaction would be. And there were a lot of those moments that just rang really true for me, where it's like, you see these guys on the Weather Channel, they're so excited about a hurricane, they're so tornadoes, and they're trying to hide it. So there's no part of you that's excited that people are dying, but you, at the same time, you can't resist, being drawn in and wanting to know, wanting to see more until, it's kind of like that moment in Zodiac in the movie where he's in the guy's house and he's in the basement. And he realized, you know what, my fear is finally strong. My fear and common sense are finally stronger than my curiosity here. And I want to get the hell out of here.
Right. Well, it's like, you always want what you can't have. And then when you get it, it's either disappointing. You're like, oh, this is the guy. Or you're like, oh, whatever fantasy you built in your head, I can't even imagine, being face to face with one of these horrible monsters in prison, let alone like in a unguarded situation. Just like absolutely crazy to think about. Do you have any theories? Who do you think the Zodiac killer is? Hot take.
Funny is I was just Googling the other day because I can't remember the guy's name. The guy's name.
The one in the movie?
Yeah, he was mentioned in the movie. I did look that guy up too, the guy at the end.
Was it the one that they made that document, the guy who like thinks his dad was the Zodiac killer? Because there's that whole conspiracy theory. There was like a documentary about it.
You know what? I don't think it was him. It was the suspect at that group went back and identified as, okay. And there was a documentary. They more or less said, okay, this is who we are identifying as. And I can't remember, but I Googled it so I could read more details. And, as usual, you come out of it with no clue. You're like,
I don't think we'll ever know.
I mean, that movie and the idea of the mask and just the randomness of it. It's like, you think, I think now, I'm like, we've got good security around here, and I'm always extra kind of watchful. And now my kids will try to spook me. They're like, now that you've written so much about it, you kind of made yourself a target, don't you think? And I actually,
you're going to attract all the crazies now.
Yeah. Or someone's going to be like, we're going to show him what a real, and I'm just like, oh shit, I don't like taking the trash out at night, which I do all the time. That's what my agent, I sent her the book. She read the sequel, and she had all these nice things to say, and she had a couple notes for clarification and all. And then she's like, why would you take your trash out at night? I'm like, I thought everyone did. It's when I remember to take the trash out, but it's because there's another scene like there is in the first book where bad things are kind of in the air, right there in the house. But yeah, I'm aware, and it I don't even like to think about it, but it's less the randomness. It could be anybody, but then you go and you do something that puts yourself in the spotlight that connects you to these people. And it's like, oh boy, I'm glad. My next book's going to be about something completely different.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Again, back to that coincidence too, where like you never know just by interacting with someone one way. I mean, the butterfly effect is an age-old philosophy, and I think that is why I'm also just drawn to the darkness and the horror, because I also think like if I witness a car crash, or if I see the remnants, like the glass on the ground, I'm always like, oh my God, if I had left a minute earlier, if I hadn't like gone to fill up my water, like one little thing, like, and every time that you drive, like you really have to think about, the statistics don't lie, except in the cases when they're like, well, you're usually going to be murdered by someone, but then you think about like the random ones are the ones you focus on too, because then you almost, you don't think those people deserved it, but it gives you a rational explanation. I think, as human beings, we're drawn to those questions that we really can't answer. So we're like, why did they do it? Who was the Zodiac killer? We'll never know. And then there's other stupider conspiracy theories like, who shot JFK, or Elvis is still alive. I mean, then that's why it gets so murky too. And that's why I love true crime, is because there is a blurry line between those. And I'm definitely not a conspiracy theorist by any means, but I think people are one step away from becoming that. And how do those people get to that point and convince themselves to is all these philosophical.
Yeah. That is extra creepy for me, because it's the you would usually be murdered by or assaulted by someone you knew, as opposed to the random aspect. And it's like, we know a lot of people now, and you don't have to. It doesn't, like, if I'm going to be murdered, I'm willing to bet. I don't even want to talk about it. Okay, that it's not someone in my inner circle of the people who I know. Okay, but yeah, I can see it being someone on the peripheral.
Like your mailman, maybe they're looking at your mail and they're like, "Ooh, what's this guy?" Yeah.
Or it's, it's my buddy who I played lacrosse with in high school, who I see once in a while. Man, I might see him every 2 or 3 years, but it's a guy he works with, who he's talked about the book, and he's like, I'm going to read this book. And then, all of a sudden it's like he shows up at 3 of my signings, and all of a sudden he's out there when I take the trash out or whatever. It's that kind of, because again, the person, a real life incident, the person who I'm close to, who was assaulted in a home invasion, that the end of the book was based on. The person who did it was someone who attended the same high school, but was, I think, 5 or 6 years older, worked for a tree service, and his boss lived in a townhouse, in a nice townhouse neighborhood, and his boss lived at the end unit, and this person lived 3 or 4 units in. So he saw her,
so creepy.
And yeah. And I mean, and that's how he was eventually caught is, the detective who just did her job, so wonderfully, just never stopped kind of revisiting things. And, during one of those sessions where it's just like, okay, just give me any name who we haven't interviewed, who, blah, blah, blah. And that tree service came up and the name came. And when the guy came in for the interview, when they brought him in, he was so nervous and was just sweating buckets. And that's where they just said, you know what? Tons of people get nervous talking to cops.
Right.
I get, I've got plenty of friends who are detectives, and I'm always, I'm like, one day I'm gonna like admit I murdered someone I didn't admit just because you got to make me feel guilty. But anyway, yeah. So that was someone on the peripheral, like 3 or 4 steps out. So when it's that whole, I always hear that same thing. It's like, you're more likely to be killed by someone, I'm like, that doesn't help me, because I think you're probably right. It would be somebody who kind of has that connection and hears about, you, and then, or they see a picture, and because, they find
right. There's those like Rebecca Schaefer and the person who tried to kill Jodie Foster, like all those crazy, creepy obsessions too.
I'm going to write about something nicer next time.
Well, but that's what's kind of cool too, is like maybe that makes it even darker, I suppose, starting out with this sort of idyllic, bucolic, middle-class childhood that harkens back to a nostalgic time that even if you weren't alive at the time, like I was, that it still sort of evokes this wonder years, this everything, the grass is green and the white picket fences and all, we don't have the phones and the corruption of social media and technology, and Columbine didn't even happen yet, like crazy stuff that has really changed how we live our lives. But I suppose that maybe makes it even dark. Again, that loss of innocence is really what I love too. And I think that Stephen King influence maybe is, I don't want to speak for you, but, Stand By Me, and you mentioned Salem's Lot, and we have, Pet Sematary, all the ones with, there's young kid, of course, how.
Well, my favorite book for the reasons I told, personal reasons, but also just because the connection that it and again, I've had people say that, did you intend this to be your big coming of age book? And I'm like, no, I've always wanted to write my own kind of version of it, but it's like that. I always thought, I think I write about kids well because I'm a big kid myself, and I have really clear memories of that time in my life. And I had all these great adventures. But I always thought it would be like it or Dan Simmons' Summer of Night. I always thought it would be more about, more of a horror book instead of a thriller. I never intended it to be, but Boogeyman is just the perfect, we all hear the cliche thing where writers say, it's the book that I, wanted to be written. And I'm like, in this case, it was the book that was already, I really was just kind of brushing sand and debris out of the way, and the book was already there. And I remember, like, again, when I turned it in thinking, I'm not going to make a lot of changes. And again, as a longtime editor, I'm always open to editing and all that. But I just remember thinking, this book's too personal, and I'm not going to make wholesale changes. If editors don't like it, or if my agent doesn't like it, I'll just put it in a drawer and publish it later as like a limited edition or something. So that was the cool thing, is that it was received, really well. And again, it was,
the zeitgeist wants it. If you look at what's popular, true crime is everywhere. And I think especially a nuanced, well-written book. I mean, everyone loved Michelle McNamara's book for The Golden State Killer. And I really think that this kind of is like the metafiction version of that. Like, I really, different stories, different situations, but also that personal connection and that way of kind of just accidentally stumbling upon this. I mean, quote unquote, the character is personally involved because lives in that neighborhood and interacted with those people. Michelle didn't, but the way that she is still able to then touch base with people, again, who were affected by it, whether it was the sibling of someone or he did leave plenty of survivors. Survivors too. That's a whole other thing that we could talk about too. Like, I can't imagine your friend must be such a strong person. And I hate to use the term even like victim too. Like, I think these people are all survivors too. Like, they went through horrible ideals, and the fact that they're able to come out and just live their lives. I mean, it's crazy.
And it takes, and everyone's different. It takes some bounce back quickly, and some take forever, and some take somewhere in the middle. And it's just, as a friend, you're just there to support and be along for the ride. And
right.
But yeah, I referenced this in a lot of the early interviews after the book was published, but it's like, I have so much respect for those true crime writers who really do it in a way that honors the victims and the survivors and their memory, and paints a really vivid, honest, portrait of what happened. I think that's important. And I've always, I think I said, I think I have to admit that somewhere in me, I've always wanted to write a true crime book. But then you look at the Michelle McNamara's of the world and the amount of research and the amount of communication they have with so many different outlets and people. And it's just like, again, not to cheapen it at all, but it's like, well, Chasing the Boogeyman was my true crime book, but instead of having to do all the research, I could just make it up.
Right. You wrote it in 4 months. Like that might've just been like her trying to get an interview with one person, like it takes over your life in a totally different way.
Exactly. So yeah, much respect to and I've read some, and I'm sure you figured this out too, or found this out, but there are some self-published or very small publishers who have released, various true crime books. And some of them are, they're not tastefully done and they're not well written, and they don't, kind of lend the proper, respect in the proper areas. I very quickly have kind of learned my lesson. All right, you can tell. You can usually tell by how they're packaged, and in that case, you can tell the book by its cover. Just I don't read those anymore, but the Michelle McNamara's and the Ann Rules, and there's a lot of them. They just do, a tremendous job. And again, I sit there and I think, you know what, I might be good for one true crime book. And that's it, because I think I would be Michelle McNamara and I would be buried. And I don't want to do, I'm already trying to figure out how to write a novel without completely, disconnecting from the world. Cause I kind of go away and I've said it many times to my family and my friends. I'm like, I'd rather take 6 or 8 months to write a book. And not feel like, everyone jokes, when Rich is writing a book, cause you have to say 3 or 4 times for him to hear you. And it's true. So and again, I'm like, waking up in the middle of the night and grabbing my laptop or my phone and writing notes and pulling over in the car. And it's like, I really want to just be like the people who write, they wake up and they go for a run or they go for a walk and then they come and they write for 4 hours and they're done.
I'm always, the fact that you wrote this book in only like 4 or 5 months, I mean, that's crazy.
I actually, if I'm being really honest, the sequel took me 4 or 5 months, and it's longer. It's over 100,000 words. This one was like 90, and I think the first draft took me like 3 months. It just flew, and which probably contributed to me not knowing at the end if this was worth anything at all. But then you get your rewrites, and you're going through. You get 2 weeks to address these changes and all that. But yeah, it was a quick one, and so was the sequel. So, and I think the sequel, sequel's modern day. It takes place now, and that was a challenge. But that's something I kind of sold them on. I think I figured out a way to, it was kind of harken back and find a lot of that innocence, because I was just out of college. I was fresh out of, I was taking those first steps into the real world. So I was a whole lot closer to those teenage years where everything happened, in that kind of Ray Bradbury, world than I am right now. But I think I figured out a way to kind of, the first one was a love story to my youth and to my hometown. And this one's kind of a love story to adulthood and family. So I think I've managed without trying to kind of keep that same sentiment and heart in the story. So at least I hope I have, because I do think by pure accident, that was a big key to the first one being successful.
Definitely. Well, I am super excited. Can you do you know when it's going to be released, or you just submitted it? So
release it, I'm assuming sometime next year.
Okay,
but
we'll keep an eye out for it. But your book, Chasing the Boogeyman, it's available in paperback now, right?
It is. Okay. Paperback and a half ago, and
we'll link it down below for everyone. Well, I could keep talking to you for hours just about like true crime and philosophical, are we born evil or is evil thrust upon it? I could go for hours, but thank you so much. Yeah, we'll come back for your sequel. Exactly. So check out Chasing the Boogeyman, everyone. Check out Rich's other books. Rich, thank you so much. This was amazing. We'll link all your stuff down below. And until next time, everyone, stay reading.
Thanks.